Hi, I'm Russ Heaps, and welcome to this segment of Beer to Whiskey. This is a new series that, for lack of anything better, we're going to call Beer 101, in which I get my good buddy here, Big Jon Richards, who is one of the more knowledgeable beer experts in the Greenville, South Carolina area, to talk a little bit about beer. And we're coming to you from basically the beer capital of Greenville, which is Barley's Tap Room in downtown Greenville on Washington Street. And Jon, tell me a little bit about how somebody who doesn't know much about craft beer can enjoy craft beer and figure out what in the heck it is they're drinking.
Well, that's a good question. A lot of people are overwhelmed by the whole spectacle of craft beer. I mean, look right behind us, and there's 33 taps back there, and that's only half of what Barley's carries here.
Right.
And so when you're looking at that kind of a selection, and you don't know exactly what you're looking at, it can certainly be daunting.
Sure.
We'll start talking from the ground and open things up a little bit, see if we can give some folks a little groundwork, if you will, to give you a little foundation for coming in the door. And it's a lot more simple than people think it is.
Do you think we overthink it? Most of us overthink it?
Oh, absolutely. It comes down to a very limited scope of foundation, and then blossoms into something that can be huge and,
right.
and frankly overwhelming, like I said. But there are a couple things that get in the way. The numbers are the first of them. We talked about that a minute ago. That you see these things like ABV and IBUs, and you don't know what they are. So we'll hit that first, and very simply, ABV is alcohol by volume, and that's really straightforward. So the smaller the number, the less it's going to send you home.
The slower it's going to send you home.
The slower it's going to send you home. That's probably a more nearly correct way of phrasing that. So your normal sort of American macros, the big guys are brewing stuff that's in the 4.5% range.
Bud, Miller, and those
Correct.
guys. Yeah.
And that's a reasonable table strength. You'll see stuff like Session IPA that's 4 to 5%, but built up with the bitterness and the citrus and floral and pine and all of that stuff to create something that's a little more flavorful, but still lets you drink several of them over a session. Which brings me right to the point where you might hear one of your buddies say, "Hey, this is a session beer." Well, that's what they mean. Is that it's a reasonable alcohol strength that you could drink several of them over the course of a session with your friends and still get up and walk away. Responsible you might call a cab at the end of it, but
right.
It depends on,
your capacity.
Your capacity and how much you've had, and of course we want you all to be responsible, but your table strength beer is built to facilitate that.
Right.
And then it jumps all the way up to something like what we have here, which is a double-digit strength alcohol beer that you would want to sip over the course of an hour and a half.
Sure.
Just to make sure that you don't stumble away.
Right.
Or find your way directly to the floor. And then you got IBUs, and that's the one that really throws people for a loop. And IBU stands for International Bitterness Units, which is a math problem describing how your beer is going to taste, which is exactly as effective as it sounds. Problem with using IBUs as a real indicator of bitterness is that there's a very big difference between actual bitterness and perceived bitterness. You take a beer like this that's dark and rich and it's got a bunch of residual sugars in it and a bunch of alcohol, it's going to cover up a lot of the bitterness that's in there. And a beer like this, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, maybe 60 or 70 on the IBU scale, but there's virtually no bitterness at all.
You would never guess that by taking a sip of it.
Whereas you pick a 6 or a 7% IPA that's in the 70% range, and it's going to be full flavored and hit you right in the face with the bitterness. So it doesn't, IBUs doesn't always translate into straight up perceived bitterness, but the human palate makes it very hard to describe perceived bitterness in a real way that translates to each individual person.
But I think as a rule of thumb, is it fair to say that the lower the IBU, probably the less bitterness you can expect?
Sure.
There are
exceptions to the rule.
Exceptions, but
right.
But
there are exceptions
typically.
to every rule. But if you see a beer that says, for instance, if there's Lagunitas has a beer called Hop Stupid. At the top of it, it says 102 IBU for you. And if you see something that says 102 IBUs, you can reasonably assume it's going to punch you in the mouth.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's a couple of other numbers that go into. I mean, you might see a beer that says, "I've got a 6% alcohol by weight," and alcohol by weight and alcohol by volume, they're the same, but they're very different numbers. Alcohol by weight describes the gravity of a beer, and alcohol by volume describes the liquid volume of a beer. And the ABV is always going to be slightly higher than the ABU in the same beer. Is that just the way the math works?
Yeah.
And then speaking of gravity, you'll sometimes see beers that say the original gravity was 1.090 Plato, which is going to mean something to a very studious beer drinker or a brewer that it won't necessarily mean anything to a regular beer drinker.
That's way too big a peek behind the curtain for me.
That's sometimes even above my pay grade.
Yeah.
Although someone like me gets a pretty good idea of looking at it, what may be coming at me, but even looking at original gravity, if you don't know the final gravity and you don't know, the brewing techniques or
Sure.
the IBUs, doesn't necessarily give you the exact answer. So all of that to say, if you've stuck with us this far, don't watch the numbers so closely that you forget to taste the beer. It's very important to give the beer a try and see what's going on there. And if you're drinking a 13% beer, take it easy. And if you're drinking a 4% beer, enjoy yourself.
Yeah.
So, the world of beer at large is a really exciting place to be. And if you get lost in the numbers, it can really start to get intimidating.
Well, I think that's a pretty good tutorial on the numbers.
It's a good start.
Yeah. And I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. And we'll see you next time. Coming to you from Barley's Tap Room in Greenville. See ya.